This year is fine. The person goes just takes 2 weeks. Preparing the lecture. Fair enough. It might take longer, but it's not.
How do you know why you want to?
That requires being kind of a finished version in some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, what's ordering that is
The tutorial was running on
the fact that we're so easy. You just do.
That's why I'm saying, why you would use it? You need a visual box, of course, she's using.
Because initially I thought maybe especially in down this year.
Yeah, so many different people. And we kind of really.
So that's why we created the visual box that
So the other thing that I was wondering is.
I just want to ask about the assessment.
Sure, no, I'm going to actually discuss it with you. Sorry. Is it time?
Small class.
Okay, I'll discuss this. I'm also going to write an email, but I just want to. I just wanted to discuss with you guys in person what was the outcome of my meeting with Ed, and then I would have written an email as well. Well, I'm going to write an email with this as a summary, but just to keep the communication verbal. So Ed informed me that firstly, let me start with the good news, reducing your workload. So there are only 4 remaining items left, barring the deconvolution assignment you guys have already received. So this is what is to come in the future. Now, there's only one more homework assignment, and this is today's lecture's homework assignment. So there will be no further homework for the remainder of the course. So it's only today. That's the first thing. So there's one more homework assignment. Second thing is there's one more Python assignment that will be released on Friday, and you would have until that you will have the rest of the course to complete that Python assignment. So there's still a lot of time. Then there's the Jakarta project that you will submit, and then there's the written exam. So that's the only 4 items in terms of work, in terms of physically doing something for the course that's remaining. So that is how we have decided to reduce the workload. So this is what we agreed upon with Ed. So only 4 remaining items left. Now, what he informed me about your examination mark, it needs to count, the written exam needs to count 50% of your final mark. So that came out in the meeting of him. So the statistics I gave on the website is wrong. I'm going to correct it to align with the NASP guidelines. So your written exam will count 50% of your total mark. Okay? Now for your semester mark, which is the other 50% of your final mark, is 20 marks will be given for your homework, only the best 5 counts. 30 marks will be given to your Python assignments, only the best 2 counts. And that gives you a total of 100 marks, and that forms the 50% of your final mark. So this is your semester mark, how it's computed. This is how your exam is computed. So in the end, this counts 50, this counts 50, and that's how you get your final mark. Okay? So the other thing is, now you can be smart. If you are already happy with your marks for your first 2 Python assignments, then there's no need to do the remaining 2. So I'm just giving you guys some information about how you can reduce your workload if you want to. So if you, for instance, do 3 Python assignments and you see you've done very well in all 3, you don't need to do the 4th one which is released on Friday. Okay, so you guys see how this can work to your benefit and how you can... okay, so is there any comments or complaints about the... Yes?
About the CASA thing,
Yes.
you should have the presentation.
Yes, there's a 5-minute presentation for
Because I feel like Ed didn't understand us very well when it comes to this. And again, I feel like the first one was better compared to this one. Having exam as a 50%, I don't really get it because we complained about the homework and after the exam is based on the homework. So
the exam was not, the exam is not coming out from your complaints. The exam is coming out from the previous, last year we didn't do it correctly aligning to the NASM regulation. So we will, because it needs to be external. So the exam is the best way of externaling the results. This is why, the reducing the workload is because of what you guys was asking to aid. Now I can even drop the presentation from the CASA thing as well if that is too much.
So can't you take, is it not possible to take the exam to 40% like other colleges?
Okay, I can ask him.
Yeah, that's Ed's decision actually.
I can ask him, but the thing is you need 50% of the total mark needs to be external. So if I make this 50%, then I need to take some of these things and external it, which is not that easy. Okay, but in any case, if you have further complaints, we can talk to Ed again and see how we can sort it out. But in terms of the exam, I don't have the complete list of what you need to study, but I'm going to completely cut the work. The work you need to study will be completely cut, so there will be a list of exact items that you need to study. Sorry?
Out of the homework.
So half of it will come out of the homework, the other half is not homework, but it's very easy. It's easier than the homework questions, basically. But I will give a complete list of, and there's only 2 homework stuff you need to study. You don't need to study all of them. It will only be 2 homeworks you'll study, and then I will give you a complete list of other things that you were taught during the year that you just need to study. So it will be, and I will release the memos for the 2 things that are in question for the 2 homeworks you need to study. Okay, that's what's basically the outcome of my
CASA is not released yet.
No, it's not released yet. Some deep is still working on it.
I just don't want to worry about it.
I will take it up with you again to finish and release. But this is so that's the current thing. So you can always talk to Ed again about the exam, but it's the easiest is for the written exam to come 50%. So yeah, so as I said, there's only 4 remaining items of work left. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Have you guys been doing the deconvolution assignment, or has that been okay? Sensible. The deconvolution assignment.
I haven't started yet.
Haven't started. Yeah. submitted another assignment yesterday, last night.
That's all right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, ask me any questions you got. But hopefully, it's fairly straightforward. And then continuing on from Oleg's lecture on Friday, do you guys have any questions about the rhyme or Jones equations? We'll get into kind of a bit of that today in terms of instrumentation. Okay. Well, so the Oleg's rhyme lecture was pretty a bit theoretical and very kind of the mathematical model for how we model these telescopes. And today I wanted to kind of do an overview of the instrumentation, kind of from a practical point of view, what actually is physically there in an interferometric array. And so if you guys have any questions about aspects of the telescope, please ask. This is kind of a bit more of a free-form lecture than the other lectures, because there's a lot of topics to cover, and I won't cover everything. So if you have something in mind you want to ask about, maser clocks or, I don't know, or aperture arrays, I won't talk about too much about that. Happy to bring them up if you are interested. When I was doing my my PhD kind of exams years ago, I had this internal examiner who was an engineer, and he sat me down. He's like, an important thing to know in life is that an instrument measures something. It's just a filter on everything else. The universe is full of infinite information, infinite time resolution, infinite frequency resolution, spatial resolution, but you have to build something, right? You can't measure all of that stuff. So when you build something, you necessarily apply a filter to the infinite universe. And it turns out that filter is also noisy, so you introduce a bunch of noise. And so that's an important thing to think about, is that the instruments we build are kind of selecting just some subsection of the universe that we have access to in whatever sense that is, but then we also include some noisy element. And so this noise is kind of what we're fighting against. If we understand that noise, we can get back to kind of the observable universe we're interested in. And so a lot of interferometry, all this calibration stuff, all this Jones modeling is really trying to understand the instrument. Because once you understand the instrument, the science becomes kind of the easy part. And it's kind of the sensitivity of your instrument, how well modeled it is, determines how good of science you can do. Okay, so Oleg, just hitting on this from Friday, Oleg talked about this idea of these Jones chains, right? We have some observable universe here that there's some kind of statement about what's true. There's some truth, maybe you might say. That there's some, like if you had a perfect instrument, there's some measurement that you can be made that seems to be true, and so that would mean you'd have full frequency coverage, full spatial coverage, full time resolution. But then it goes through all these effects, whether they're kind of intermediary effects through whether it's something like the ionosphere or the interstellar medium or something that's actually astrophysical, or it could be instrumentational, right? It's the fact that we have these elements that have some primary beam shape. We have these filters that basically filter out certain frequency bands. We have these correlators which need to be quantized to have some efficiency or to be computationally efficient. And so we model this as Oleg talked about on Friday, about these Jones matrices which are linearly chained together. The idea is that if you model everything as a linear transform, then you can do the inversion operation and do calibration. That's real key. Now, these things might not actually be linear. In fact, you dig deep enough down, they're not linear, but the first approximation, linear, is good enough. And so then we can use this Jones chain model and break things down. And then, again, stealing from the whole slide, this idea of the system Jones matrix, right, is that what we want to do is, what we do in the end is like, is we, our electronic signal, our digital signal is voltage. Voltage, which is some sort of linear representation of the the current from the sky, right? So, for example, our telescope, we have some dish, we have some receiver system that points at some bit of the sky. There's some current induced on it by the electromagnetic waves. That current is an induced current, registers some voltage on some A to D converter, and we record that voltage. And so there's some idea that that voltage is linearly related to the EM wave that we're observing. And so we're starting from E, this idea is the true signal, we end up with V. There's all these different components of the system that add some sort of transform. And each one of these Jones matrices, remember, can be dependent on time and frequency, position in the sky. That's generally how it's modeled. I can't think of anything else. Well, polarization, of course. Polarization plays a real key part of this. Okay, so the kind of a typical sequence of the Jones matrix would be this J-cis here, right? So this F and Z are these not related to your instrument, but they're factors such as the F is the Faraday rotation of the sky, right? There's some induced polarization rotation due to the ISM or the IGM. Then this K, the P is a parallactic angle. You have some dish that's moving, right? So you have some receiver feed that's rotating as it goes through the sky. And each receiver arm measures a different mode of polarization. As you're rotating it, you are switching between polarization modes, so you can correct for that by rotating it back. The K is this kind of inherent Jones term that's geometrical, right? And I think Oli talked quite a bit about it. This is kind of a funny one that's always there. This is the fringe relation between the two baselines. So it's a baseline Jones vector. These last four, this G, B, D, and E, all have to do more with the instrument itself. So the E is what we call the primary beam matrix, the E Jones, and that's depending on what type of dish you use. So if you use a simple dipole, you're going to have a different E Jones versus a large dish telescope. Something like Meerkat has a Gregorian offset beam. That's going to be very different than the Cat7 or VLA, which is kind of on-center beam. So the D has to do with this idea of this receiver. With the primary beam, you have some optical system. You can do ray tracing. You can measure kind of where the points of interaction are, and so you can create some beam model. But at the focal point of that geometry, those optics, you have to put a receiver there to detect the signal, right? The big dish is there just to focus energy at one point, but at that focus point, you have to include that receiver of some sort. And so that receiver is necessarily some polarization, right? You can't build a full polarization receiver. It's just not how it works. You have to pick two modes in order to measure the full polarization. So that can either be linearly polarized or circularly polarized. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. But important thing to know is that there's some linear transform that goes from the primary beam optics to this receiver. And then the G and B are very related to the G Jones and the B Jones. So B is bandpass, G is gain. There's this idea that our system is made up of electronics, and electronics change, their response changes over time. So say the day heats up, your system's going to get noisier, or say your bandpass is being cooled, and so if the cooling changes, it can have weird shape changes. And so that needs to be constantly updated at some time scale. And generally in modern telescopes, the G and B Jones are calibrated on 15 minutes and hour-long time scales to monitor the evolution. The important thing to bring up and remind you that, I'm sure I'll talk about this, was that kind of the ordering of these, in this matrix operations is that you can just, scalar matrices can move around everywhere, that's fine. Diagonal and rotational can commute with themselves, but sometimes you can't change the order. And that's very useful, but it's a nice mathematical trick, but it's useful to think about this as like, at some point you have some signal, this E signal that's kind of came from some original astronomical source, and it's propagating through each Jones matrices to get to V. And so it kind of doesn't make sense that one should come before the other, right? You shouldn't expect the effective gain to affect things before, say, it goes through Faraday rotation. So it has to, there's some sort of time evolution of it in some sense. But you can use some of these tricks. So like the G and B generally can swap back and forth. D and E are very related. And like K you can move around because that's just the baseline operation. Okay, kind of visually thinking about this is that we have some bright source up here, right? And we have these two ideas of, did Oleg talk about directional and direction independent effects? No? Yes? No? Direction independent, direction dependent? Did you guys, maybe? But anyways, it's important to think about, you can kind of think of, there's two kinds of effects you can think of going on here. So we have some sky in the black up here, with some source with some brightness model, and we're measuring the Fourier transform of that with our K matrix. But before it gets to the telescope, you can have all sorts of different effects coming from different directions. Say you have some ionospheric model spread throughout the sky. And so if the source is over here, coming down to you versus over here, you're going to have a different effect. And so that would be a direction-dependent effect, right? And so depending on where the source is in the sky, it'll affect it. And also, say you have some primary beam, some dish, and you point it here, looking up this way, you can still see sources this way, it's just going to be a different effect than if you pointed it this way. So this idea of the beam has some response in all directions, but it varies depending on how you point it. So that would be a direction-dependent effect. But once it reaches the dish, once you measure it, once it hits that receiver, you move from that direction-dependent regime to the direction-independent regime. Because at that point, it's just two wires, one for each polarization coming in. And so there can be no kind of concept of direction independence. It all has to be direction independent. And so these effects are the electronic gain variations you have. So when we talk about calibration next week, there's kind of these generations of calibration. This idea of there's this first gen, second gen, third gen. And generally it's easier to do this direction independent correction and ignore the direction dependent corrections. And so that's the first type of calibration. Then the direction dependent calibration is a lot trickier. Trinko will talk about this. But it's good to keep in mind where these effects are coming from. Okay, I have my toy example. An idealized source. This is my perfect source, right? We can model a source as having some frequency dependence with some spectral index alpha. This is a very typical radio source, right? That's how we, you'll look in, when people talk about the spectral index, they're talking about a source model like this. If you look at most real sources, they don't look anything like this. They have some weird structure, but this is our idealized source. And so if you were to make an observation of that and just record what you see out of one dish, you would see something like this, where in time there's no flux change, it's some constant flux, and then there's some spectral index to it. Nice, smooth, no noise. That's kind of the ideal measurement we would like to make, right? This is our true signal that we want to get to, but we don't get there. So I started from this. I'm going to walk through a few of the electronic effects and get us to what we actually see. Okay, so there's an important concept about system temperature and system noise. How we talk about noise is that in radio astronomy and a lot of antenna kind of fields like radar engineering and stuff, we don't talk about noise so much as temperature. And they're the same thing, right? Maybe you remember this, but this idea of this Johnson-Nyquist noise is that given for a black body, you can say the power of that source is Boltzmann constant times some temperature it's at, times some bandwidth it has. So if you measure the temperature of a resistor, you know about the amount of noise, right? This is black body thermal, and you can rearrange it, you can come up with just the temperature. And so when people talk about the noisiness of it, of some source, they talk about the temperature of it, or the noisiness of a system. You just model it as one big temperature. It's kind of an odd usage of relationship, but it's been around forever. And it's kind of, it makes sense once you spend a bit of time thinking about it. Okay, so when we talk about the system noise, the system noise is basically when we make a measurement, how much noise is in that measurement. And so there's a few factors that go into this. So first of all, we have the sky temperature. That's something we can't change. That's when we look up the sky, no matter where we look in the sky, there's the temperature of the CMB, right? It's 2.5 kelvins just sitting there. So it's always going to be that. There's always at least 2.5 kelvins of temperature or noise in the sky. But depending on where you are, or at what frequency you're looking at, you'll see more temperature. So low frequency below 100 megahertz, the sky is very hot, you would say, because of synchrotron. And so it can get up to thousands of Kelvin in noise. And so then you also have stuff like the atmosphere. The atmosphere introduces a bit of noise, especially at the higher wavelengths. So the water in the atmosphere is a great absorber, very noisy. And so there's these windows where you can only observe that millimeter wavelength because of water. And then there's this idea of spillover. So you have some antenna. You've designed some antenna that points off to some bit of the sky, but it has most of its gain is in one direction, but it's in fact sensitive to all parts of no matter where it is, it's always sensitive to other bits. And in fact, it's sometimes sensitive to behind it, much weaker than its forward gain, but it still picks up a bit. And that's this idea of spillover, and as we know, the Earth is about 300 Kelvin, and so that means it's about 300 Kelvin of noise getting picked up a little portion of that. And so all these these effects add in, so you want to build the idea is you want to build a good primary beam that doesn't have a lot of spillover. You want to select your observing frequency well. You're kind of stuck with the sky. You're stuck with the one thing we can control is this idea of this receiver temperature. Is that we can make these cooler and cooler. That's kind of what we do with technology, is to improve this receiver temperature to become more sensitive to the sky. And this receiver temperature, I'll talk about in a minute, is Freeze cascade noise equation. It's a very simple kind of concept. You rarely actually use it yourself, but I'll kind of give you an idea for it. Right. Before we move on. So this is a classic image of the temperature of the sky at different frequencies. So there's always this, you always have the CMB hanging out here at some temperature, and typical L-band observations, the sky is somewhere around 10 Kelvin. You're never going to get lower noise figure than 10 Kelvin, even if you have a perfect system temperature. So that's kind of a good thing to keep in mind, is that so Meerkat right now, which is being tested, is about 20 Kelvin receiver temperature, and that's very good. That's a beautiful system, and that's about twice as hot as the sky there, and that's a pretty good metric. It makes less and less sense to improve that receiver temperature. And if you look at these very low frequencies at about 100 megahertz, where the sky is 1,000 Kelvin, it doesn't matter if your receiver is 20 Kelvin or 200 Kelvin, it's still dominated by the sky. And so lower frequency arrays like LOFAR don't cool their receivers or anything. Typically they're 300 Kelvin, and that's such a small fraction of the 1,000 Kelvin that there's no point in trying to improve the receiver there. But there is in this kind of sweet, what they call the watering hole, at least in SETI, there's this concept that between 1 gigahertz to 10 gigahertz is this nice clean space of the radio band where our sensitivity is maximal on that. If you were an alien species and you were going to send an alien signal, you should do it in this watering hole. That's on how much of a philosophy on. But anyway, so this section that's quite, you want good system temperature. As you can see, then becomes a higher frequency, it's atmosphere that dominates a lot of the noise. And so there's these holes you can get, these little drops here between, but the system temperature picks up pretty high, and so your receiver temperature doesn't need to be as good there either. It's really in this unique radio band that we're interested in, having very low receiver temperatures. Okay, so this freeze equation, just to give you an idea of why it's important and why we focus on things, is that if you want to work out what the temperature of your receiver is, you have to kind of you chain the system. It's called this cascade equation. Is that the first thing you have is first component you have is there's some temperature in the feed. The feed, when I say feed and receiver are terms used interchangeably, but there's some when the E&M waves hit the receiver, they induce a current, and when you induce current onto something with resistance, there's going to be heat, right? No way around that. There's some amount of heat, some temperature induced, and it's quite small usually, and so that this T feed is usually ignored. I mean, it's practically nothing, because the electromagnetic waves are so low energy, there's not that much temperature. Then what happens is you have to go from that feed, and the signal is so weak you want to amplify it, right? That's the big thing, is that these radio signals are extremely weak compared to everything else we do in the world. And all the gears we built, we need to bump and boost them up in some way. And in order to do that, we use what's called a low noise amplifier. This is the most expensive component of the system. Yeah, it's an amplifier you want to cool down to 10 Kelvin, whatever the 8 Kelvin if you can get it. Really is you use liquid helium to cool it down, and you need to stabilize it. It's really tricky. I would recommend never being involved with designing LNAs. They're really difficult to use. But anyway, so you have some feed, you have some LNA, and you have to get it there. You need some cable between them. And in order to get from your feed to your LNA, this passive element, these passive components introduce other temperatures into it, right? They may seem small, but they actually introduce a little bit of noise. And the fact is, any noise you introduce before that amplifier is going to be boosted, because it's an amplifier, right? It makes the signal stronger. So you really want to go as soon as possible from the feed to the LNA. And so it's the first component almost always in a receiver system is this LNA. Well, once you get to this LNA, you get this idea of these gain terms. Gain can be seen as both positive and, not positive, it can be seen as greater than unity, right? As in boosting the signal, or less than unity, reducing the signal. And so even though we use the term gain, these can mean amplification and attenuation. And so generally, something like a passive component will introduce attenuation, which is bad, less than 1, right? And this whole feed is nominally 1, it's not really introducing gain. And so this temperature, you look at the temperature, which will be some value, let's say it's only 8 Kelvin, but if this is less than 1, this will make this component larger than 8, make it 12 Kelvin or something, right? And so the closer you can get this to unity, these factors to unity, the lower this receiver temperature will be. So this is kind of the trick that people are playing. But once you go through this LNA component, now you have the gain term of the LNA, which is usually a factor of 100, a factor of 1,000 or something. And so then you have a lot of room to play with. And so even if these are less than 1, the fact that this term is 1,000 means it's still going to be much higher than 1. And so from there, you can start adding in other components. You have filters, you can add second stage amplifiers that introduce a bunch of noise, and you can boost the signal more and more, but it's really important to get that LNA in first before any other component, because the sky signal is so weak compared to the signals we look at. Have you guys covered the radiometer equation before? No. Okay. Well, the radiometer equation is kind of fundamental to radio astronomy if you're doing single dish or interferometry. It's this idea that it codes this idea that should make sense to you, is that if you look at a source and the longer you observe it, and the more sensitive you'll become to it. Is that the longer, and in fact, not just longer, the more bandwidth you cover, the more sensitive you are to it. And this is a fun one to work out if you guys ever want to sit down and work through it. But the idea here is that you have some kind of noise measurement, whether it be an interferometric array or just a single dish spectrometer measurement, that RMS noise is dependent on the system temperature. And so the higher the system temperature, the higher the noise, right? That makes sense. But then what you can do to improve that is you can have more bandwidth. And this is kind of assuming that sources are continual, right? This doesn't hold for spectral line sources where it's very narrow band. But if you have a source that's kind of has some spectral index and some area, there's some coverage from 1 to 20 gigahertz. If you can cover that full 20 gigahertz, you're going to pick up more sensitivity. And then, in fact, the longer you observe for it, you can kind of coherently add the signal, and the noise will go down while the signal goes up, right? But only as a square root of those. And so that's kind of a bit of the trick, is that you don't get anything for free. It takes longer and longer to get more and more sensitive. So this is very important for noise measurements, and I'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about how we measure the kind of the thermal theoretical noise of an interferometric image. But before we do that, I want to talk about this idea of the SEFD, which is a system equivalent flux density. And this is a funny number that only radio astronomers use. And it can be thought of as, it's kind of a funny thing, is that say you have a sky, say you're measuring some nominal source that you don't know what it is, but you go from a system temperature of some value X, and then you look at that source, it goes to 2 times X. Then whatever that doubling is of that source strength is the SEFD, in the sense that you don't know, it's kind of a way of relating Jansky's to your system noise temperature. And so, of course, the lower your SEFD, the better you are. The equation for this is this system temperature divided by your gain. And so, again, you have a lower system temperature, but this gain term relates to, effectively, you can, for the moment, let's think about it as the size of your dish, right? The bigger your dish, this A effective, that's the area of your dish. And then these other these factors is a Boltzmann constant. That Eta factor is the efficiency. So when you do dish design, there's some spillover. I'll talk about that stuff in a minute. But if you have a larger and larger dish, your SEFD will go down, right? And so this makes sense that if you take the same receiver system and you take it off of a Meerkat dish and you put it onto the 350-meter dish at Arecibo, you should expect the SEFD to go down, right? Because the area is so much bigger. And in fact, you can think of this also, instead of just one Meerkat dish, you have all 64 of the Meerkat dishes, the SEFD should go down because your A effectiveness increased. This is, so for something like the VLA, this is a very nice plot that people have done, showing the SEFD as the different frequency bands. And so you can see the VLA is really, at L-band it's not actually very good, but you can see this is S-band, C-band, X-band, and all these bands. The SCFP is quite low, and that's well designed for that. But at this higher frequency Q band, what's happening in Q is that the VLA dishes aren't built for that kind of resolution, in the sense of the kind of the dishes are kind of have some wobbliness to them. They're kind of rough, right, at such high frequencies, and that the efficiency of the dish drops off. Whereas in L band, what you're starting to see in the VLA is that it's starting to pick up the system temperature of or the sky temperature. It's getting hotter at these lower frequencies, and so this is not something that you can really improve on here. It's actually there's something a little bit you can improve the receiver temperature a bit, but for the most part, that's about as good as you can get. And you can kind of see this classical watering hole going on, right? Going back to here, same idea. This is a VLA, and this is a VLA range, and you see that kind of dipping shape, and that's to do with the sky temperature for the system. Okay, so this is I think the important slide to remember if you're doing interferometry. If you want to, so you've gone through all your process, measured your baselines, you've recorded your visibilities, you've done your imaging, you've done your deconvolution, maybe you've done some calibration along the way. You're going to end up with an image, and you're going to go, well, does this image make sense compared to what I should expect? And you first need to know what you should expect. So there's this idea of we can measure the theoretical thermal noise of our image. Is that ignoring confusion noise and kind of all these systems and whatnot, we should be able to say, looking at the kind of measuring the pixels within our image and measuring the RMS noise of that, there should be some theoretical noise we should get to. And this is what this equation says, is that for some SCFD, which is quoted by any telescope you use will quote its SCFD. So for MeerKAT, it's something like 20 Kelvin. And then you have some factors here, the number of polarizations. It's almost always 2. It's rare that you'll see 1, but for example, right now MeerKAT has 32 active dishes, but I think they're only measuring 1 polarization at the moment because the correlator can't do all polarization, so that might be 1 sometimes. Either way, it's either 1 or 2. And now the game with interferometric arrays is that you get this factor of n times n minus 1, right? You're measuring all these baselines. And you can kind of make that approximation that's like n squared, basically, so it's a factor of n, 1 over the factor of n approximately. And so that's a really big kind of boost to using more and more antennas in your aircraft for your sensitivity. And then these last 2, your integration time and your bandwidth. So whenever you make an image, say you're getting to the point where you want to say, and actually it's pretty useful to do before you even make the image, you have some observation you made of some field you're interested in, there's some element of science I want to do here, this is a source that I find really interesting. It's really a good idea to work out your theoretical noise beforehand and say, okay, I expect 10 microjansky of noise based on all my observation information. And then when you actually make your image, do you get that? And if you don't, you need SY. And if you get below, then there's something wrong, because this is the absolute limit. You should never get lower than that, because this doesn't take into account all sorts of instrumentational effects. I think if you work out this and you go through and you make an image and you see you're within a factor of a few, you've succeeded. You're not generally going to do better than that. Yeah.
But the number of polarization,
Yeah.
is it changeable?
What's that?
Is it changeable? I mean, it can be changed for, you said it's usually 2, right?
It's almost always 2. Sometimes it's 1. But that depends on your observation you're making. So you'll know in the observation.
Is it would be quadruple?
No, it won't be a quadruple. Unless you come up with something unique. You could, There could be a way to do. No. Actually, I was about to say something. In aperture arrays, there's something where you could actually do 3, but it's a very rare case. But basically, the 2 modes measure a complete polarization, as long as they're orthogonal. I'll make a point for now, I guess. Okay, well, say, so a very simple telescope or receiver has two polarizations, right, X and Y. And then you have some source going across it. As it transits through, you're measuring the complete mode. Now, this very simple model holds until you think about it too much, but in fact, what we do is we have some dish, right? Some feed up here, and we track some source, and it moves, and we move the dish to follow it. And that's fine and all. But there's another type of telescope we use, which is called aperture arrays, where we build a little antenna, actually a collection of antennas here. And the source moves across here, but these stay fixed on the ground. And so what's in fact, if you can imagine this, is that looking at the source from here is going to look different than from, it's look different from here, here, and here. In fact, what it'll look like is if you project on that dipole, the first one will look something like this, and then the next one will look something like this, and I'm trying to think of how it will go exactly. Oh no. So what will happen is that at each moment, the dipole, the receiver will look different. One of the arms of the dipole will actually shrink and become less sensitive. And so that's because you aren't physically moving the dipole like in a dish. So by moving this, there might be a rotation thing, but what you're actually doing is you're projecting this into different angles of the dipole. So you can actually include a third mode in it that accounts for it. This is called the tripole. Very theoretical. No one uses it. It's not real. So that's the only time you have 3 polarizations. Yeah.
The integration time, is that the total observation time or the
what?
The time
Oh, the total observation time, yes. Yeah. That's why you can see it's kind of theoretical that some of the time won't actually be useful. Okay. Right, and so so where is all the system noise encoded is in the G and B Jones matrix. This the G and B Jones are basically the electronics that they represent the receiver noise, and so typically what you'll have is you can take. A lot of times people talk about a single G Jones matrix, but in fact it's a G and B. And B is the bandpass, so it's a frequency-dependent structure of so you build some system, it'll have some filter response, and that's based on the design you've done. And that's pretty stable with time. There might be a little time dependence, but not really. And then there's the G component, the gain, is that has to do with how cool you keep your system. The classic one I remember seeing there's this telescope array out in California called the ATA, the Allen Telescope Array. And I remember it was the first time I used it, and you'd see let's see, looking at just the gain of it versus time. So this is T, this is G, just kind of taking the total power, you'd see something happen like this. And it was very odd. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? And this is kind of roughly, I don't know, something like 60-minute timescales. And I'm like, well, what the heck? Why is that gain varying like so rhythmically on 60-minute timescales? And I asked someone, and they're like, oh yeah, that's the air conditioning. And so what was happening was that the air conditioning would turn on, cool everything down, and slowly heat back up again. And once it got to a certain temperature, the room would cool down again, right? And it would affect the gain of your telescope. And this is what this G. Jones is taking into account. This is an extreme effect, but kind of the same idea is going on here. Is that, you know, especially out in the crew, change how cold it is during the day or during the night versus how hot it is during the day, you're going to have different variations of your G. Jones that you can't really correct for. You just have to measure and fix on the fly, basically. So physically what's going on here, you can think of this as being, this G. Jones is that we have some receiver which turns our sky signal into some voltage by inducing the current into some antenna that's hopefully designed well, it responds and everything you want. And then the first place you want to go, so this idea of there's something called Balun. I don't know if you have your antenna engineering background. Balun's an important component of matching the impedance of the sky versus matching the impedance of like the electrical system, but not too important. Then this kind of, you have this first stage, which is, as I mentioned, this low noise amplifier stage, which is really kind of the heart of the whole electronic system. And if that messes up, the whole thing's not going to work. So typically what you do is you for something like L-band, you want to cool that system down using something like liquid helium, as I said. And so what you use is this two-stage cryostat, they call it. So basically a cryostatic refrigerator to cool everything down with liquid helium. And so you might, first thing you would do is you'd have this outer shell that's cooled down to 70 Kelvin, and that's maybe cooled with liquid nitrogen or something, or some amount of liquid helium. And that's kind of, that varies a bit. You might have an amplifier in there kind of later on. It's really an outer casing shell. And then in the heart of it, you have some very cold region, which is where your LNA is. And that's where you're kind of, you'll have to put your LNA in there. You might put a noise diode or some very kind of temperature sensitive components are there. And so you can do your initial amplification. So when it comes out, you have a much stronger signal, sky signal, compared to what came in, with as little noise as possible introduced. And then from there you can do kind of your standard stuff. You can add in a bandpass filter, you can add in notch filters to block out RFI. You usually want to mix your signal down with some local oscillator, and then you eventually digitize it. I'll talk about this all as we go. But that's a very typical path for the electronics of the telescope. Here's just an image of one. This is for the Ghana VLA or VLBI dish that's gone up. And so to show you all this stuff, it's all a big mixed mash of stuff. Signals come in here. There's some amplifiers here. This is not actually the LNA amplifier. There's some amplifier before this. This is the second stage amplifiers. You can see there's a few filters here and there's some mixers, LO, and the idea is that once so this is all stuff you can kind of, if you're really excited, you can go buy online. Quite expensive bits, but you can still buy them online. Once you have a signal that's bright enough, strong enough, that enters here, once you've gone through the LNA, you can kind of apply standard RF engineering techniques to filter the signal that you want. Why we filter signal, I'll talk about soon enough. Okay, here's a picture of a cryostat. It's a big mess. And so you have to think, when you're building something that's going to be cooled down to 20 Kelvin, you can't just screw in a bunch of wires and buy and hope for the best. What happens is you have to worry about things like if you're going to glue something down, you're going to have to worry about outgassing and the parts coming apart if they can handle that temperature differential. If you're starting at something that's 300 Kelvin at room temperature, cooling it down to 20 Kelvin, what's that effect going to be? Is it going to contract? Is it going to expand? And as you can imagine, going from 300 Kelvin to 20 Kelvin, you don't want to just do that in 5 minutes. Sometimes it takes days to cool these down. So if they break, it takes days to fix them, which is really quite annoying. Again, why I recommend never being involved with them. This has this outer structure, typically that's cooled to some kind of fairly cold level. Then you might have these other this inner chamber that's cooled even further. And then if you can, you want to connect the receiver directly to that inner chamber. You might use something like what's called an ortho mode transducer, or you might just have these wires that kind of expand and contract and can kind of handle that temperature differential. But they're tricky. This is a very common point. I remember I put this slide in last year because someone asked, and this is such a small thing, but really important to know, is that when people often quote power in units of decibels, it's just such a typical thing, especially when we're talking really high dynamic ranges. And then there's two types of decibels. And you have to be really careful when you're talking about electronics, which one you're talking about. Because it's a small thing, but there's a factor of two. You're talking about the power of something. Say you've taken some observation, you've recorded your spectra, your power spectrum. The decibel unit is just that 10 watt 10. Right? That's because you're already in units of power. But if you're measuring some voltage in your electronics, there's a small change. It's just a factor of 2 here in that 20. But that can make a difference between a really good measurement and a really crappy measurement. That people screw up quite often. Just keep that in mind. What are you turning into decibel units, into voltage and power? Okay, so going back to this point, there's this idealized source that we started with. Remember the nice spectral index, flat frequency, or flat flux, constant flux with no time variation. Now we're going to run it through a kind of typical electronic system and see the resulting effects. So the first thing that happens is you'd have some LNA response. And so the LNA response isn't going to be perfect for frequency. It's going to have some gain, a typical gain between 20 and 30 decibels. But it's going to wobble a little bit. There's these standing waves, it's just how you design it. But that's fine. If this is stable, that's okay. That's something you can correct for. Now there's going to be some time variation just because of the changes in temperature and whatnot. And that's harder to measure. But you still have to factor in the fact that that's going to happen. And you can try to make this better or more constant, but it's always going to be there. So you're going to introduce this structure into your source. Show you what a boring LNA looks like. This is an LNA. This is about this big. Usually, I think this one costs something like, 6,000 euro or whatever, so 60,000 rand. They're crazy expensive. Yeah. So they have to be made by hand. There's some guy out in Sweden, just like with amazing NASA level soldering skills. Doing that. I guess it's a lucrative job if you want it. Okay. And then, so also we want to filter some band. The source, the sky signal is infinite, as I said, but we're only going to measure a certain band because our equipment's only set up to measure a certain band. So in fact, we want to cut out the frequencies outside of that band, because if not, they'll alias in and it'll just build up within our measurement, and that won't work. That would be, we won't be able to measure fringe, we won't be able to do correlation, and and that's just because of microsampling. And so what we need to do is introduce some sort of bandpass filter. And so a typical this is Chevy filter, and you have a nice flat response in the middle over some 500, 400 megahertz band, but then on each you have the roll off on the edges. You have to roll off within the band because you want to make sure all the signal outside is compressed instead of in these ends. And so say we introduce some other concept like something like R5, mobile signals that are really, really quite bright. Mobile signals are going to be billions of times stronger than any radio signal we measure. We really want to get rid of that. We can't make any measurement around this for these really bright signals. We can never measure a radio source near there, just because it's not just that these are sharp or bright, but in fact they have little side lobes, structure all around them, so you really just want to get rid of them. And so what you can do is once you've digitized it, you can do RFI flagging and clip them out. But in fact, these are so strong that when they enter the system, they can affect other electronics because they go from this kind of electronics are built to have some linear region where they operate nominally. And then if there's too much power going in, they start operating non-linearly. And so when that happens, the whole system is done. And so what will often happen is that you see when you're making an observation, there'll be some like radar that goes off. A plane will fly by and they'll shoot off a radar. And in fact, that radar is fairly narrow band. Radar is typically kilohertz in bandwidth, but it's so bright it actually blocks out the entire band, and you'll lose a few seconds worth of observation. Because what's happened is that RFI has hit the receiver, and even though it's right here, it's just all that power is spread out everywhere, and you move to this non-linear region. And so if you know that RFI is going to happen in that particular region, particular bandwidth, it's better to build in a filter before you get to the electronics that can potentially be non-linear. But the cost there is that you're going to lose a little bandwidth, but you're going to make sure that you don't saturate your system very often. And so this is our example. We have some bandpass. We have some really bright RFI that dominates. And now we can include something like a notch filter that would chop out, so the bandpass and notch filter are kind of opposite of each other. Here's kind of some typical R5 ones. So this is the LoFar band. LoFar has 3 bands. This is LBA, and it has 2 HBA modes, so low band array, high band array, high band array. And so what you can see is you can see some bandpass shape here. So there's some very sharp cutoff here, and then there's a structure here. That's the bandpass shape of the LBA. And this is the bandpass shape of the HBAs. Now what you see here in red and these bright spikes are different types of R5. At very low frequency, the sky gets really hot. So that's why that first cutoff is there. And then there's this VHF, very high frequency communication. This is like if you use old CB radios or this old Soviet era communication equipment and Cold War era. That's what's going on there. It's like marine information. So if you want to bounce stuff off the ionosphere at great distances, that's what's going on here. And then there's the FM band, FM radio, and you can see it's not really present. What LoFar really had to do in order to observe there is make really, really sharp filters and to cut out that band, so that's why you don't see it, but in fact it's quite bright there. And then there's some other stuff, these kind of bright, fairly narrow band signals. This Orbcomm one, which is a satellite system that you can never get rid of, that's for communication across the world. That's been up there for decades. Then this is digital TV, which is very strong and actually fairly wide in bandwidth. Phenomenons, other stuff. But an L band will typically see mobile cells. But there's a lot of these sharp radar features that aren't going anywhere. So one thing you can do is you can choose a site, like Peru, where there's not much R5. But there's always going to be stuff. There's always going to be satellites going by. There's always planes flying over. And so if you know something about that frequency space, you might want to just cut it out before even worrying about it. So here's a kind of a typical RFI plot. over some bandwidth and some time, this color represents some bandpass shape, you see. And then what you can see here is there's these little kind of these regions of constant RFI going off, these kind of linear bits. There's these little blobs too, of just things turning on and off, intermittent stuff going on and off. Here it's pretty flat, and here's kind of a nice part of the band, and so you don't really need to worry about it, but you might want to put in notch filters around here. You can see this bright, this kind of shape went off here. It's that something obviously big went off and took things to a kind of non-linear saturated region. And so there's nothing you can do about that. You just want to chop out that bit of time and say, I just won't get that observation. RFI is very pernicious. The radio signals we're measuring are so weak is that even if a little bit of RFI gets in, it can ruin the entire observation. And so, as you do interferometric imaging and observations, you'll spend a lot of time trying to clip out RFI. It's not ideal. Okay, so this band filter, you can build these band filters like the inverse of a band pass filter. Notch filter is the inverse of a band pass filter. It's one in normal units, one in dB. So you can create these kind of sharp chops. And so when you apply it to this, you can apply it to the band pass, and then you can, where is it? It's not showing up yet. Okay, so yeah, this is with, this is our band with some RFI, and once you apply this notch filter, you can see that a lot of it's chopped out. And that's good. That means that this is very reasonable power range that we can deal with, and that the likelihood of an RFI saturating the system is very low then. But you can see we've lost some amount of bandwidth because we've had to create that notch. Should we take a break? I didn't realize what time it is. We'll take a break. 5-10 minutes, and then we'll continue this. Are there any questions? Yeah, I'm going to continue rambling about instrumentation unless you guys have other questions about instrumentation. Yeah, so there's a lot to cover, and we probably won't get to it all.
I've just confirmed with Ed that all the subjects in ASP is 50% for their time. So you're welcome to go talk to him in person about it, but I've just confirmed via email, so it will count at the moment 50%.
Day-to-day life, it won't be too important, is that there's this thing called the local oscillator. Say you're observing at some higher frequency, 1 gigahertz, but typically what you'll do is you only care about maybe 100 megahertz of bandwidth. What you want to do is you can take that 1 gigahertz signal and mix down 100 megahertz at maybe 1 gigahertz to 1.1 gigahertz, and you can mix it down to 0 to 100 megahertz. And you do this because then it's easier to build electronic components that sample that lower bandwidth and at that lower frequency. And so what you do is you use something called a local oscillator, which is just a very nice sharp clock that operates at some frequency, and then you do what's called heterodyne mixing. And you can do that by multiplying the two signals together. This is a very typical technique in that you can work through the math, but what happens is when you multiply your two sine waves together, say you end up with a low frequency component and a high frequency component. Once you're at that, then it's pretty easy to filter out that high frequency component, and you have all that you have left is a low frequency component. This is how we do mixing. You can do down mixing, and in fact, you can do up mixing too, depending on how you want to do things. There's certain cases where you might up mix. Okay, so adding this all together, remember our idealized source with that nice sharp shape, that nice clean time and frequency. When you add in things like system noise, the bandpass shape, the LNA shape, the filters, the RFI, you might end up with a signal that's quite typical like this, right? Where you, depending on different times, you'll have different frequency responses. The amplitude will vary, and you'll see this interesting shape. Now this is all instrumentational effects, right? And nothing about the sky. There's some sky signal embedded in there. We just don't really see it. We just see this structure. And so if you know something about your instrument, which you should because you built it, you can ideally reverse back and recover the true sky signal up to the noise threshold. So yeah, that's our transform between the two. I'm going to skip over digitization. I will just make a point that this is an analog system. We have analog components, analog gains, analog filters, but at a certain point you take that analog signal and you want to turn it digital, right? Then we can do all sorts of cool stuff with it. Particularly, in fact, we want to digitize as soon as possible because when you digitize, you can get rid of a lot of these analog effects. The downside to that is kind of in the name, is the digitization, is that you're going from this continuous analog signal that's infinite in time resolution to a very structured digital resolution. But that's okay, you digitize it with enough bits, and it's kind of very low loss of signal. I'm not going to talk about this because of time, but it's interesting here. Okay, so up to this point I've been talking about a single dish, but of course we're doing interferometry. We build interferometric arrays to do correlations on the baselines, to measure visibilities. We need to somehow correlate it, right? And correlation is easy. You have two signals from two antennas, and you multiply them together, and then you kind of add a little bit to kind of get statistically significant kind of sample, and that becomes your visibility measurement. But you have to do that for every pair. You have to do that very fast because you have, n squared number of these because of the baselines, and you have to do this for every frequency channel you do. So it turns out it's quite a computational task. But it's a very simple task, and so it's not going to change. Once you build your array, you need a correlator to correlate it, and that correlator is not really going to change very often. And so what we want to end up with is we want to end up with these 4 correlator products. And the correlator products are basically, we have 4 because there's 2 polarizations on each antenna. And each one is complex, right? And our visibilities have to contain that phase information. That's really the power of the interferometric array, is that we can use that phase information to do our Fourier transform. Okay, and then going back to my favorite theorem is about the convolution theorem, is that, well, how do we do correlation? So correlation and convolution are equivalent to kind of a phase signal, a signal offset, or sine flip, sorry. And so by convolution theorem, you start with some time sample of sky signal. That's what's coming into the telescope. And in order to get to our cross-correlated power spectra, what we need to do is, there's kind of 2 paths to do. And this is, first you can do is you Fourier transform it into this frequency domain, which is turn it into some spectra. And then this is a CMAC, which is complex multiply and accumulate, which is a nice word for given 2 spectra as you multiply them together, and then you add them together for a while. Complex multiply and accumulate. That gives you some correlated power spectrum. You can do it the other way too. In fact, you can take your time signals, multiply them together, and then do an FFT. This is what would be called, so there's this idea of F and X direction. So you often see people talk about, oh, this is an FX correlator. So that means you do the F component first, the Fourier transform, and then the cross correlation, the X component afterwards, FX. Every single correlator today is built as an FX. They used to build them as XF, but it turns out they run out of, they're easier to build initially, but because of the tech today, they're very limited to use. So no one ever uses XF correlators anymore. Always FX. I'm not sure I want to talk too much about this. Okay, here's the layout of the FX correlator. Each one of these is your antennas. And the first stage is this F operation. And in fact, it doesn't just do a Fourier transform. There's this thing called a PFB, a polyphase filter bank. What it is, the polyphase filter bank, a PFB, is these, this thing stuck in acronyms. You apply a FIR, which is a finite impulse response, and then you do your Fourier transform. Doesn't really matter what you do. The important part to know is the PFB is kind of like a nicer FFT. It has a lot of, by including some extra computational cost, you can produce kind of a nicer spectrum. And that's why people do this. Okay, so you make your FX, your F operation, you do your FFT, you have your spectra, and then you need this big web, this kind of big interconnect between every single baseline, right? Every baseline has to multiply against the other baseline. And this is a really hard thing to do, because you go from n independent signals, and you need all n of those signals to interact with each other. And a lot of design goes into this architecture and how to do it, like how it would work. But at the end of the day, you have to have some big mesh network to connect them all. And then once you do that, then it's easy to do the correlation, this complex multiplying equivalent. So it's a multiplier and then a summer. And then out from there, we got our visibilities. It really is, the correlator is very simple in concept. It's just really hard to implement because of the technical difficulties of such large systems. And then I'm sure maybe you guys know about it. And then as Meerkat is being built out, I keep going back to Meerkat because it's the most interesting telescope at the moment. There's different stages of the correlator being built right now. There's a 16-element operating correlator that operates, but eventually, by the end of the year, it needs to be 32, and then eventually it'll be 64. But you just can't scale it up as easily, because going from 16 to 32 is not just doubling the number of antennas, it's quadrupling the number of correlations, right? We talked about fast Fourier transforms. You guys know it, I hope. PFBs, good. We'll talk about those. Okay, so a typical. So what does this end visibility look like? Maybe you've looked at them already, but you might have a very typical thing to do is look at the band passes or look at the kind of single time integration. So given two baselines, or two antennas, 0 and 31 in this case, you can look at their autocorrelation. Their autocorrelation looks pretty good. They look the same, right? Except you see the spikes. Of course, there's R5 showing up. So the red and the blue are pretty close, but you can see there's some variation between them. So each antenna is getting slightly different R5. And you can see their antenna gains are slightly different too, right? They're not quite perfect. But what you can see, looking at the cross-correlation between them, you all of a sudden go from this nice flat region with some R5 spikes to a much deeper region. And you start to see some interesting stuff, right? You see these R5 spikes are still there, but then you can go dig even deeper. In fact, you see this like flat shape up here, and that's actually a system effect, and that you wouldn't have seen in a single antenna, but looking at the correlations is that something's gone wrong here. Whereas this region is actually pretty clean. That's just kind of noise, right? If you integrate for longer, you should expect this region to go deeper and deeper. In fact, this is, we made this a few years ago looking at trying to understand what's wrong with the sensitivity of an interferometric ray. And we didn't understand this until we started looking at these correlations. It turns out the system was poorly designed. It costs a lot of money to fix. Anyways, so another typical thing to do is you might just look at the phase. So this is that same array. This is an array in Italy, actually. Is that for different baselines, you can look at the different phases. So given some source in the sky, what's the fringe pattern between different baselines? So, for example, 0 and 28. It might be useful for me to write out this antenna, this array. So this is a very odd array shape, but it's simple. It's a square. And it's like another. So there's 8 by 4. This is the array layout, so there's 8 of them. There's 8 rows of 4. And so how's the label? I think it's like a 0, 0. This will be 28. And so this is an array layout. And so for baseline 0, 28, because they're perfectly north of each other, the sources up, you expect basically no fringe pattern because it's a north-south baseline. So remember this. Now for the 0, 1 baseline, 0, 2, and 0, 3, so this is 0, 1, and then this is 0, 2, this is 0, 3. So you should, these being equally spaced, you should expect the fringe pattern to be equally equally spaced or increasing in multiples. So if you look at 0, 1, there's kind of roughly 2 rotations of the fringe pattern. In 0, 2, there's kind of 4, and then here there should be something like 8. And then it kind of makes sense. Your antenna positions being equally spaced, you should expect to see that. You can kind of, looking at this, once you look at enough fringe patterns and phase plots, you can start to make out the array diagram in your head. And that's when you know you're in trouble. Okay. So primary beams are really the forefront of a lot of research into how we do calibration and how we do imaging. So typically, as you recall, when we talk about imaging, is that if we have some beam, we're looking at some region of the sky, an important thing we say when we do imaging is that we're doing a small field approximation. We're looking at a small chunk of the sky. And one of the reasons we do that is because the primary beam, even though pointing in one direction, has some shape and some kind of uniform response. So by picking just a small region of the sky, we're picking a small region of the primary beam. And that way we can kind of continue to use the small angle approximation, and everything's fine. Same with Fourier transform, right? Small region, so we can use Fourier transform. But an interesting thing to think about, and kind of in particular why Meerkat is smaller dishes at 15 meter compared to some of the older dishes like VLA, is that this idea that, well, we're not going to use this small field of view approximation anymore. We're going to image larger regions of the sky. And we have the computational power to do imaging that doesn't require the perfect Fourier transform. And so the primary beam is playing more and more of an issue, and it's an interesting topic, and as you get more into interferometry, you'll deal with more. The E-Jones is this term that represents this primary beam shape. And so it has some function of frequency. So depending on how the objects are designed, it'll have some response to different frequencies. If you build a dish for very low frequency, like something like Arecibo, if you ever go to see Arecibo, it's just these big panels with holes punched in them, and to make them lightweight, right? They're aluminium, and they're just kind of structured like that, and they're kind of glued in and whatnot. But for low frequency, that's fine because the kind of imperfections of that dish are small enough compared to the wavelengths of observation. Whereas if you want to use it at high frequency, 10, 20, 100 gigahertz, it's just not going to work well because those imperfections are so massive. And why you do that is it's cheaper to not have to be so precise, but at some cost. And so something like ALMA, which does 400 gigahertz, 500 gigahertz, something has to have really precise dishes at a really significant cost. So there's that is this imperfection, but then how you design the dish has to do with the bandpass response, the frequency response. And then you also have this effect of, you're pointing the dish in some direction, but if there's a source out here, there's some sensitivity to it, and here sensitive to it, and here sensitive to it. So depending on where you are, this theta and phi relative to where you point the dish has some sensitivity. And you can imagine imaging it, imaging near the center of the dish, or what people often call the term bore site. Bore site is where you're pointing your dish. That's like the reference point which everything builds from. If you're pointing at a bore site, you can kind of approximate everything to be the same primary beam response. But going out, the primary beam response is going to dip down in some interesting way depending on how you designed your dish. And so there's all sorts of optics and whatnot. This is typical stuff. So something like, the simplest thing you can think of, which they built at the GMRT, you have a dish, optics, the light comes down, it points up, and there's a receiver at top. Very simple optics. And the problem with that is if you have a big receiver there, it's blocking some light. And so that's not very ideal. More ideal would be you'd have light coming down, bouncing up off of some small thing and bouncing down. So that would be a Cassegrain feed. So the VLA, for example, is a Cassegrain system. And so that that reduces the amount of blockage you have. Even better still, which is what Meerkat's built up, is this offset Gregorian. The idea is that it's kind of half of a parabola. You imagine you take a parabola and then you cut it in half. And then you can kind of fit your optics so all the light comes down here, reflects this way, and bounces down. And so you have no blockage. And this turns out to be a really good design. It just takes a bit more. But the reason this hasn't been used so much in the past is because of the simulation tools. But you can kind of imagine basically all modern radio arrays are going to use an offset Gregorian system. And so there's all these kind of efficiencies people talk about. So these efficiencies that you'll often hear about are kind of simplifications of the E-Jones, kind of global simplifications. And they're not quite right, but they're often useful. So you can have inefficiencies due to as I said, surface imperfections and variations in that. There's always going to be some level of imperfection. If you have some blockage, right, there'll be light that just can't get through there. So you lose some amount of sensitivity because you're not collecting there. This idea of spillover is that the light comes down and then say you have some optic system here. Well, some of the reflection is going to shoot right by it. You're just can't. There's going to be some inherent spillover because if you build this bigger to make sure there's no spillover, you're increasing the amount of blockage. There's some trade-off between those. What we think is useful. And then there's these things like design how you do this thing called taper, which is something like Arecibo is 350 meters spherical, and it moves the secondary system, but it doesn't illuminate the whole thing. It only illuminates part of it at a time. And that's how the optics work. And so you don't ever get the full 350 meters of Arecibo. So all this stuff is kind of useful to think about. It's always, someone pointed out to me, I'm not sure if you guys have thought about this before, the glass, you put a glass of water down and you see the light shoot through it, the caustic pattern. And I always thought that was useful. And so the caustic pattern has to do with the different frequencies of light creating different patterns of incoherent, incoherent, adding and subtracting. And that's why you get that structure like that. So that's the light going through the water is the resulting pattern is the optics at different frequencies. And so if you were to build a receiver for that system, you would want to build it near the brightest bit, right? Because most of the sensitivity is going. And you wouldn't want, you kind of have an idea of where to build this. Okay, so what these things are, they're kind of hard to visualize, these primary beams. I'll try to show you some examples of it. So typically what you would have is you build some dish, which is the idea is it collects light from one direction, but there's some light coming in from other directions it's still going to pick up. And And so the main direction builds up from this red bit is what we call the main lobe. It's most sensitive to air. That's where you want to look. That's where you build it. But it's also sensitive to other bits, these side lobes, because of coherent adding and subtracting power. There's always going to be some spots where there's a bit of power leaking in. And so stuff like this, you can imagine you're looking in some direction here, but there's a bit of RFI here leaking in because of one of these side lobes. And then you have this thing called the back lobe, which you really do everything you can to reduce that, because that's going to contain a lot of noise. Remember, if you have a dish pointing up the sky, the opposite of the sky is always going to be some part of the ground. And the ground is hot, and the earth is warm. And so we want to reduce that as much as possible to make it really a minimal amount of gain. And so we typically, people talk about this idea, there's these two factors called the directivity and the gain. Directivity is a measure of how kind of narrow your beam is. So something like a receiver, which is massive, has a lot of directivity. It's really, the beam is very small. And in kind of related to that, you have a high gain. So the idea is that you measure that against something like an isotropic beam, which sees everything in the sky equally. And that is a gain of 1 by definition. And so your gain is measured relative to that. These are kind of, there's a lot of handbooks on this and whatnot, and kind of, if you want to get into it, it can get quite complex. Okay, so receivers, I don't want to talk too much about it. Two types of receivers. There's typically, you'll see a linear and circular. These are, if you see the terminology, you'll see a D or C Jones term. The D Jones has to do with the receiver. It's that this is a linear system, and there's always going to be a leakage between the two, no matter what. It's a physical component. There's some amount of power is going from one to the other, and so that's the D Jones. The C Jones is how the receiver is set relative to the sky. It's just a chain of parameters, really. And then you have the circular horn. And so there's kind of these two designs have two different uses. Most of the stuff in astronomy are not circularly polarized. If it's polarized at all, it's going to be linearly polarized. And by kind of there's some convention and there's some wisdom that says that if you know the polarization of your source, you should use opposite receiver system. So if we have linearly polarized signals in the sky, we should use circular feeds. And the idea with that is that circular feeds can fully measure a linear system independent of its rotation, and the opposite. So most satellites in the sky are circularly polarized, so you want to use a linear feed. In radio astronomy, though, we use linear feeds to look at linear signals, which seems not like a good idea. But the reason we do that is basically we can do a bit of correction. But it turns out linear feeds are much easier to build for really big bandwidths. For narrow-band stuff, you want to do the opposite. You want to do, if your signal's circular, use linear. If the signal's linear, use circular. But if you want really big bandwidth, the only way to do it really is with a linear feed. So that's the choice that was made. You'll still see some circular polarized receivers in radio astronomy, but they're usually fairly low bandwidth. So they're older systems. I think the VLA still has some stuff. There might be stuff at VLBI that still does.